competing. Now, there's a lot of things you can do as the Apple vendor, right? You can run a product strategy. You can say, I'm going to try to have the biggest apples. I'm going to have the shiniest apples. I'm going to have the apples with no bruises. You can run a sales strategy. You can say, I have my Apple stand, but I'm going to hire kids to go in the traffic jams in the cities to sell apples car to car. Or I'm going to sell my apples to the food stores. Or I'm going to sell my apples to businesses, for their lunch break. Or I'm going to sell my apples to restaurants. You might go in other directions. You might say, gee, I'm going to open up a cooking school in my Apple thing, and I'm going to teach people to make apple pies, okay, and charge for my cooking school. So you can go a lot of different ways. So here's the interesting thing about strategy. Let's say you determine that you want to go after the restaurants. And the restaurants want to buy medium-sized apples with no bruises, medium-sized apples. They want to call you in the morning and they want you to deliver by 11 a.m. every day. Okay? Now, to execute that strategy, everybody that touches your product has to execute that strategy. The product manager has to make medium-sized apples with no bruises. The factory, the farm, has to grow them, deliver them. You need a supply chain that can deliver them every day, take an order every day and deliver by 11. And you need the finance guys not to fight you about inventory when you got to build inventory to execute your strategy. So that's the interesting thing about strategy. Strategy is how the organization decides to make decisions and makes those decisions consistently so you don't get conflicting outcomes. That's what strategy does for you. And that's the problem with the price buyer and technology buyer example. People were making decisions that were inconsistent and drove the business in different ways. And if you want to execute good strategy, it needs to be simple enough that when you tell the business, this is my strategy, all the functions in the business recognize what they need to do to execute the strategy. Okay? So go to the next slide. All right. So, most businesses, they don't actually think about strategy. Because your history tells you that strategy doesn't make that much of a difference. Your gut tells you and your history says that if you come to work every day, you work hard, you make the business work better, that everything's going to be okay. And it turns out that year over year, that's actually right. The major driver for performance for businesses year over year is more about the industry you're in than how you run your business. In fact, it's around 70% of the results of a company are predetermined by how the industry does. If car automakers are doing good, all automakers tend to do good, right? Computer companies, if computers are selling, all computer companies tend to do well, okay? So the problem with strategy is that you sit there and you say, gee, I just execute what I have to do. I'm almost home, I just have to tweak things to make it a little better. I don't have to change things to make it better, right? That's the problem that's why most companies actually don't have strategies that are articulated that everybody understands and buys into. Because if you were happy with last year's performance and the industry's going okay, you just keep doing what you're doing. Here's the real problem with that. Okay? Your competitor might have a strategy. That would be a problem. Or you might get this. So give me the next slide. Somebody might come and introduce the green apple, right? In your Apple stand. Go back to my Apple stand. It turns out that if people don't like the green apple, you made a big investment, you might lose money. But if people liked the green apple, you might lose all your business, okay? Because they've innovated in a way that changed the market. And that's the danger with not having a strategy, not watching what your competitors do all the time, not understanding where you're going to be and what you're trying to do, is that you need to work on strategy for defense, right? So that somebody doesn't invent a green apple. And for offense, because you don't want somebody to innovate around you, to change, to put a better strategy in place and make your performance worse. Okay? The performance doesn't get bad in a day. Usually it takes some time. Right? So, keep going to the next slide. So let me talk about Kodak for a second. Because this is the hard part about strategy, I think. Companies have inertia, right? They have huge inertia. You know, the press, we were all reading about Kodak's failure for 15 years before it failed. You know, 15 years we were watching them succumb to digital photography, right? It was a slow motion defeat. Everybody in the world knew it was happening. It was a slow motion defeat. And it wasn't that they weren't trying to do something. You know, they introduced digital cameras, digital picture processing. You could go and they actually bought in 2000 an online photo company. The same kind of company that Facebook just paid $1 billion for. They paid $1 billion for an online photo company that has 0 sales. Kodak bought one in 2000. So at dinner last night, we were talking about companies have inertia. And the problem with putting in place strategies is that a lot of times, like Kodak, they couldn't get the business to buy into having a different strategy. And they ended up failing. Okay? And this is very common. This is probably the most common problem. And what it tells you is this. A strategy that you can't actually execute is not a good strategy. Even though it could be a great strategy for someone else. If you can't get it done, it's a really bad strategy. And so in companies like GE, in companies like GE, you know, we talk a lot about, well, can we really do this? Because if you can't get it done, it's a bad strategy, even though it might be a great strategy for someone else. All right, go to the next slide. All right, so now that I've talked a lot about strategy, and I'm hoping that you believe that strategy is important, how do people define strategy? So here's 3 great thinkers on the topic. Barney, strategy is a pattern of resource allocation, neutralizes the threats and exploits the opportunities. Porter, a formula for how the business is going to compete, what its goals should be, and its policies. And Peterson, strategy is simply the sum of an organization's choices about where it will compete. Now, the inside of GE Energy, this year's book to read is something called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. I wrote down the author's name because I never remember. It's Richard Rumelt. In the backup to this, you'll get a copy if you want. There's 6 books on strategy that are pretty good. This is one of them. And so we're always reading these books on strategy. Okay, we're always doing that. Because we're trying to figure out what the best people are thinking about strategy. Now, here's my caution, and I think our professor friend from yesterday left. My observation about strategy books and stuff is that you have to read them to get insight. But a lot of them are written to create a process so somebody can sell you consulting services. Right? And so they're interesting to read, but I would tell you that I don't believe there is one formula to come up with strategy. That it's about how the business management team gets together and makes decisions and decides where to go. Okay? So we read all these books, but I can't tell you, here's the book that's the right formula, because I don't believe there's a formula that works for every company, because there isn't one formula that works in every GE business. In our 100 businesses, they're all different. Okay? So that's sort of my caution on strategy. Okay, so if you go to the next slide. Okay. So let me try to tell you how strategy is different from tactics and different from goals. Let me give you this example. Let's say your strategy is to be the low-cost producer or something. Okay? A tactic to execute your low-cost producer strategy might be to build your new factory in China. Okay? And a goal might be to build that factory in the next 12 months and have it be 10% lower cost than every other competitor factory in the world. Okay? The strategy is not to build a factory in China. That's a tactic. Okay? The strategy is to be the low-cost producer. Okay? If you start with the strategy, you can come up with a lot of different tactics. If you start with the tactics, you're constrained. So Sun Tzu, do you know The Art of War? He's a great Chinese writer on the art of war. He said, if you have a strategy and no tactics, you win over time. But it could be slow. If you have tactics and no strategy, for sure you lose. Okay? And I think that's the way to think about it. Now, these things aren't independent, of course, because just like Kodak, where they had a strategy they couldn't execute, strategy, tactics, and goals are sort of interdependent, because you can pick the right strategy. If you can't execute, it's not a good strategy. So you have this sort of loop that you have to make sure you can actually go and execute. All right. So if you go to the next slide. So what goes into making a good strategy? You have a lot of things to consider when you think about strategy, right? These are 7 things. And you are as important, understanding how you actually do business and how the business actually works is as important as anything on the outside, right? So like my example from our business that didn't recognize what they were doing in the marketplace, selling to the technology buyer and the low price buyer. So you needed some way to take into account all these different things. And different businesses, some of these things are more important than others. So that's why I say it's the management team that has to come together to look at all these different aspects and decide where to take the business. It's hard for somebody from the outside to come and do that for you. They can help you think about it, but they can't actually have the insight to deliver you a strategy. Normally, the business team has to make the strategy. Okay, so let me give you a couple examples of strategies that people ran, either because they had to, or some of these I want to talk about because they give you some different lessons about strategy. So I'm going to go to the next one. So here's the Nook. So we talked about Borders at the beginning. They went bankrupt. They couldn't adapt. Barnes & Noble found a way to survive, okay? And they survived by building the Nook. And they changed their business model, because now they sell as many books online as they do hard copies, okay? So here's a business that, to survive, they had to go in a totally different direction, okay? And that's the other thing about strategies. So when professors come and talk to you about strategy, they always talk about 2 kinds of companies. Companies that normally are startups, right? And I'm going to talk about a few of those. And companies that are under amazing pressure for survival, okay? Those are the examples you always get. And the reason is the 68% rule, right? Most of your performance is tied to how you did last year and how your industry is doing. But here's an example where they went in a totally different direction to survive. But they did it. Okay. But it's hard. Okay, go to the next one. Okay. Here's an example of a very subtle difference in strategy that has a great, amazing difference in outcome. This is on the Does anybody recognize the symbol on the left? That's MySpace. Do you remember MySpace? They're before Facebook. Okay? In MySpace, you could go and create on the web a customized view of you, right? The customized view. You could put your picture anywhere you wanted. You could design it any way you wanted. An amazingly flexible tool. Facebook. You go to Facebook, there's a place for your picture. Everything's organized, right? You can put down things, but you have to put them exactly in the right spot. They've organized it for you. So, how many of you would have picked before it was won, the battle took place in the marketplace, that the winner would be the company that gave you the least flexibility? How many of you, anybody? No, nobody picks it, right? Because everybody's focused on the product. What's Facebook's strategy? MySpace's strategy was to give you a place to define yourself. Facebook's strategy was to create a place where your friends could look at you. Okay? So the strategy defined the product they built. And this is really an incredibly subtle difference, right? An incredibly subtle difference. They both make pages, the products look the same. One gives you flexibility, they're the loser. They're the loser. It's an amazing outcome, right? The strategy is not what you think. It wasn't at all about the product. The strategy was about how they connected you. And they won. And they gave you the least flexibility. Right? Think about that. I have a program in GE Energy, 40 MBAs from around the world. None of them would pick Facebook to win when you ask them. They all pick MySpace. Okay? So the difference is, can you as the business team understand in your business this very subtle kind of differences that make a huge impact?